Improving profit and profitability. Firstly, profit. So we know the definition of profit is the surplus of revenue over cost. And what this means is our formula is that profit is simply revenue take away costs. And if we want to try and improve profit, that then means we've got two aspects to play with. We've got the revenue side of it and we've got the cost side of it. So improving profit, we want to try and increase revenues and or make our costs smaller. So if we're talking about improving profit, the absolute amount, so £100 million that the business makes in a year, then we've got two aspects to play with, increasing revenue or reducing costs. And we can do that in a number of ways. So costs obviously is made up of fixed costs and variable costs. So you could make savings on either of those aspects. The potential issue with thinking about cost saving to improve profit is if you cut costs back too far, does this have an impact on quality? And if it has an impact on quality, that might mean that costs in other areas rise, scrappages or customer refunds, customer service, that type of stuff. Or it might mean that it has a knock-on effect on your revenue. So if your quality of your product is perceived as poor by the customers, they might stop buying it. But that's one way to improve profit. Theoretically, you just cut your costs and keep cutting them and your profit should improve. The other side of it is the revenue side of the equation. Revenue, as we know, is made up of selling price multiplied by the number of units sold. So here again, there's two aspects that we can look at. If we want to improve the absolute amount of profit made, you could just increase the number of units sold and that will increase the number, or you could potentially increase the selling price. As we know, with selling price, we've learned about this concept called price elasticity of demand. So as you know, that actually it's not as easy as just increasing the selling price, because if you increase the selling price, you would expect demand to fall, and our PED concept explains how much you would expect demand to fall. So actually, it depends whether the good is elastic or price inelastic as to whether you would need to increase your selling price or decrease your selling price. So for example, if the good is price inelastic, then any increase in price will be met by a proportionately smaller fall in quantity demanded. So overall increasing your price would lead to revenues increasing. However, if the PED was elastic, then the opposite would be true. An increase in price would lead to a larger proportionate fall in quantity demanded, which would mean if you've increased your price, your overall revenues would fall. So in the case of elastic goods, if you wanted to improve your revenues, you would actually need to decrease your price, and then hopefully, other things being equal, this would then improve your profit. So some complications, but hopefully we know all that, and that's pretty straightforward so far. So why is profitability different? Or is it? So profitability looks at how effective the business is at turning the revenue it's got coming into the business into profit. And at the moment, we're looking at profit margin as our measure of profitability. So this is profit divided by revenue times 100. And I'm talking generally here, we need to know about gross profit margin, operating profit margin, and profit for the year margin. But in general terms, what you need to do to improve all of them is very similar. So In this case, we've got profit on the top of the equation, revenue on the bottom, and profit, as you know, is revenue minus cost. So we've got some revenue on the top and the bottom of our equation. But to all intents and purposes, the variables that we can play with are exactly the same. We've got our costs and we've got our revenues. However, the difference here is that profitability, we're not looking at the absolute amount of profit, we're looking at this relationship between profit and revenue and how the business manages this effectively. So, for example, we've just been talking about price elasticity of demand. For an elastic product, the business will get much more sales volume if it reduces its selling price, and that would increase profit. However, reducing the selling price is going to reduce its profitability. So it'll sell lots more units, but it will sell each of those units at a lower margin. So this is an example of where, actually to improve profitability, the effectiveness at which it's turning its revenue into profit, you might actually want to say, well, actually, we'd be better off increasing our selling price, but that for an elastic product would mean that they would sell fewer units, and so their overall profit would be less. So although you're playing with the same variables, the impact on profit or profitability can be a little bit different. So you just need to think through the two. So always a business is just trying to manage those two things, the absolute amount of profit it gets and the margin or its effectiveness at the same time. And you'll find there's a little bit of tension between those two things. So from our point of view, does any of this really matter? And of course, the answer is it does from an exam question point of view, because quite often, I've spelled profit wrong there, quite often in a question, you'll be asked about something or other, and you'll be asked to explain the link either to profit or to profitability. So you must get across, if the question asks you about profitability, you must somehow get across to the examiner in your chain of argument that this is about that relationship between profit and revenue and changing the nature of that relationship. So, for example, with profitability, if we're talking about increasing sales volume, but doing that in a non-price way, so for example, running an extra advertising campaign to make people more aware and trying to create extra sales, then that might not actually change that relationship so much. And it depends on the additional costs of running the marketing campaign. And it also depends on if the volume changes are significant. So, if they're significant, then you might start to introduce things like economies of scale or diseconomies of scale even, which would change the costs in the equation as well. So that would change that relationship. So in an exam setting, it's all about getting across that profitability is about how effectively the business is translating revenue into profit.